Maren Callow did not scream. When Grayson Pike shoved her into the concrete wall behind Brackenridge Medical Center, his forearm crushing her throat, the heel of her skull hitting the surface hard enough to split the skin above her eyebrow, she did not scream. Blood tracked down her cheekbone in a thin line. The security cameras along that corridor had gone dark 18 minutes earlier. The loading dock lights had been out since Tuesday. 3 nurses stood less than 60 feet away, behind a door that muffled everything. Grayson had watched her for weeks. He had studied her schedule, learned her route, waited for the right night. He had decided she was exactly what she looked like, a tired woman in scrubs who had made the mistake of filing a complaint against the wrong family. He did not know she had kept 4 soldiers alive in a forward operating base with no power and 2 units of blood left. He did not know she had been documenting every incident for 93 days. And he did not know that the man she had called 2 hours earlier, the one with the Belgian Malinois trained in tactical pursuit, was already moving through the lot on the other side of the wall. Grayson thought he had come to end things. He was correct. He just had the wrong person in mind. If you've ever watched someone stay quiet because the system told them to stay with this one, and if stories like this matter to you, subscribing takes 2 seconds and it helps more than you'd think. Maren Callow had learned early that competence was its own kind of armor. She had enlisted at 22, completed combat medic training at Fort Sam Houston, and deployed twice, once to a forward base in eastern Afghanistan, once to a joint operation in northern Syria. She had worked under fire, in the dark, with equipment that was never quite enough. She had made decisions in seconds that civilians spent years second-guessing. She had watched people die and kept moving, because stopping was not an option the mission allowed. When she came home the second time, she did not feel like a hero. She felt like a person who had been running at full speed for so long that standing still made her dizzy. She had a recurring nightmare about a dust-off that had arrived 8 minutes too late. She had a small scar on her left forearm from a piece of shrapnel she hadn't noticed for 4 hours. She had a moderate case of PTSD that she managed with therapy, routine, and the deliberate construction of a life that made sense. Belmont Cross made sense at first. It was a mid-sized town in the hill country, the kind of place with a farmer's market on Saturdays and a single main street that still had a hardware store. Her mother, Ellen, lived in a pale yellow house on Crestfield Drive and had been asking Maren to come home for years. The drive from the interstate took 20 minutes through cedar and limestone, and the first time Maren made it, she had exhaled in a way she hadn't in a long time. She took a position in the emergency department at Brackenridge Medical Center 8 months after her discharge. The hospital was mid-sized, perpetually understaffed, and housed in a building that had been expanded so many times it had stopped making architectural sense. The ER was competent, but overworked. Maren fit in immediately, not because she was warm or easy to talk to, but because she was steady. She showed up early. She did not complain. She did not panic. She knew how to triage, how to hold a vein, how to talk someone down from a spiral without letting it pull her in. Her charge nurse, Deanna Walsh, told her during her 3rd week, "You're the kind of nurse I want next to me when it goes bad." That was as close to a compliment as Deanna ever gave, and Maren had accepted it the same way she accepted most things, with a nod and a return to the work. Belmont Cross was not what it appeared. Most towns had a version of this truth, but Belmont Cross had refined it into something elegant and deliberate. The families who held power here had held it for 2 or 3 generations, and they had learned to hold it quietly through board seats and charitable donations, through the right handshakes at the right fundraisers, through the kind of influence that looked like generosity from a distance. The Pikes were the clearest example. Conrad Pike had made his money in real estate development, buying land at the edges of the hill country towns before anyone else realized what was coming. By the time Maren arrived in Belmont Cross, Conrad had his name on a wing of the hospital, a youth athletic complex, and a scholarship fund at the community college. He sat on the Brackenridge Board of Directors as a major donor. His opinion on administrative matters was not always spoken aloud, but it was always understood. His son, Grayson, was 31 years old and had never been told no in a way that stuck. Grayson was not employed by the hospital. He had no formal role there, but he moved through Brackenridge the way certain men move through spaces that belong to other people, with the casual authority of someone who has never been asked to justify his presence. He knew the department heads by first name. He stopped at the nurse's station to lean against the counter and tell jokes that no one laughed at but no one interrupted. He used the physician's lounge. He parked in the staff lot. When he first noticed Maren, she was suturing a laceration on a 40-year-old man's forearm, clean, efficient, 3 interrupted sutures, and a knot that would hold. Grayson had watched from the doorway of the exam room and said something she didn't fully hear over the ambient noise of the department. She glanced up once, registered that he was not staff, not a patient, not someone she needed to address, and returned to her work. That was where it started. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had seen it before, which meant it was invisible to almost everyone. Grayson began appearing during her shifts. Not always, not obviously, but with enough frequency that Marin noticed the third time it happened, which was the same week she started keeping notes. He made comments. Some were compliments framed as entitlement. "You're too good-looking to be stuck in this department," and some were simply intrusive, personal questions asked in front of colleagues who laughed nervously or looked away. He brought friends sometimes, 2 or 3 men who dressed the way Grayson dressed, and thought the way Grayson thought, and they would stand near the nurse's station in the slow hours and treat the ER like a venue. When Marin did not respond the way he expected when she gave him the same flat, professional non-acknowledgement she gave every non-essential interruption, Grayson escalated in small increments. He started commenting on her movements, where she was going, when she'd be back. He told one of the medical students that Marin needed to relax, that she took herself too seriously. He said it loudly enough that she could hear. None of this was dramatic. That was the architecture of it. Each individual incident was deniable, small, something that could be dismissed as a misunderstanding or an overreaction. Taken together, they formed a structure. Marin documented all of it. Date, time, location, exact words when she could remember them, names of anyone present. She had learned in the army that the difference between a complaint that went somewhere and a complaint that disappeared was usually the quality of the paperwork. She kept a log in a notebook she stored at her apartment, and she emailed herself summaries with timestamps. The first complaint went to Marta Kincaid, the director of nursing. Marta was a capable administrator who had learned to navigate the hospital's political landscape by never stepping on anyone who could step back. She read Marin's written complaint with the careful expression of someone calculating risk, and she said the words Marin had half expected. "I understand this feels uncomfortable. My advice would be to avoid escalating the situation unnecessarily." Marin asked what Marta intended to do about Grayson Pike's presence in clinical areas. Marta said she would look into it. The looking into it produced nothing. 3 weeks later, Grayson and 2 of his friends approached Brielle Santos near the supply corridor on the 2nd floor. Brielle was 20 years old, a nursing student completing her clinical rotation, small and quiet, and working extremely hard to build the kind of record that would matter for her career. Grayson's friend had made a comment about her appearance. Grayson had laughed. When Brielle tried to walk away, one of them had stepped into her path and asked where she was going in a tone that was not a question. Brielle told Marin about it 2 days later, her voice carefully controlled and her hands not entirely steady. "I didn't want to make it a thing," she said. "I didn't want it to affect my rotation." Marin filed a second complaint. This one named specific dates, specific individuals, and referenced the prior complaint that had produced no action. 2 days after that, she found a folded piece of paper inside her locker. It read, "You don't know who you're dealing with." Fletcher Dane ran the administrative side of Brackenridge with the polished neutrality of a man who had spent 20 years ensuring that problems resolved themselves in the direction most convenient for donors. He called Marin into his office on a Tuesday afternoon and offered her a chair and a glass of water she did not touch. He acknowledged that the situation was concerning. He used the word process 4 times in 12 minutes. He did not say Grayson Pike's name once. When Marin asked directly whether Grayson would be prohibited from entering clinical areas, Fletcher said that the hospital had to balance multiple interests, and that these things required careful navigation. He said it with genuine sympathy, which she found more troubling than hostility would have been. She understood what she was being told. The internal structure was not going to protect her. The board had a donor's son walking the halls, and the administration had decided that protecting the institution meant protecting him. She drove home that evening through the last of the October light, parked in front of her apartment building, and sat in her car for a few minutes without moving. She was not afraid. She was something colder and more precise than afraid. She was assessing the situation and identifying her actual options. She could minimize contact, file no further complaints, keep her head down, and preserve her position. This was the rational short-term calculation. It was also a form of capitulation that she had not been built for, and she knew it. Or she could continue documenting, continue filing, protect Brielle and the other young staff who had no institutional leverage, and accept that the hospital's administration had already decided whose side it was on. She got out of the car and went inside and opened her notebook to a new page. She wrote the date. She wrote what Fletcher Dane had said, word for word, as accurately as she could reconstruct it. She noted his tone. She noted that he had not made a single written commitment. Then she called Ronan Sutter. Ronan was not someone she talked to often, but he was someone she trusted with the kind of precision that came from having seen a person work under pressure. They had met during her second deployment, during a joint operation that had required a combat medic and a SEAL element to operate together for 72 hours in circumstances that Marin still did not discuss in detail. What she knew about Ronan was that he was methodical, that he did not exaggerate, and that when he said he would do something, he did it. He had left the Navy 4 years earlier and built a private security consulting practice that mostly handled corporate threat assessment and executive protection. He traveled with a Belgian Malinois named Rook, a former military working dog that Ronan had adopted after the animal's handler was killed in action. Rook had been trained in tracking, detection, and protective work. He was, by any objective measure, better at his job than most people Marin had worked with. She gave Ronan the short version. He asked 3 questions. Do you have written documentation? Have you retained a lawyer? Does the family have local law enforcement connections? She had documentation. She did not yet have a lawyer. She did not know the answer to the 3rd question, but she had her suspicions. Ronan said, "Get the lawyer first. Don't go anywhere in that building alone after dark, and send me everything you have tonight." Marin said she understood. She did not yet fully understand how right he was. November came to Belmont Cross with 3 consecutive days of rain that the local weather service had underestimated by a significant margin. The creek that ran behind the commercial district overflowed its bank on the 2nd day, and by the 3rd, the roads along the hospital's eastern perimeter were partially blocked by construction barriers placed to protect a drainage repair project. The barriers redirected foot traffic and redirected assumptions about which routes were being used and when. Marin had been working the evening shift 3 to 11 for the past 2 weeks. She preferred it. The ER moved faster in the late afternoon, and by 9 o'clock it had settled into a rhythm she found manageable. On the night it happened, she clocked out at 11:14, changed out of her scrubs in the staff locker room, and left through the medical education corridor, which connected the main building to the rear parking structure. It was the route she had used a dozen times. The overhead light at the exterior door had been out since at least Tuesday she had noticed it, had intended to submit a maintenance request, had not yet done it. She pushed through the door into the damp air of the covered walkway. Grayson was already there. He stepped out from the shadow beside the concrete support column when she was 6 feet from the door, and he moved faster than she had expected from someone who had always presented himself as casually superior. He had her against the wall in 3 seconds, his forearm across her throat, his weight leveraged to restrict her movement, the back of her skull striking the concrete hard enough to open a cut above her eyebrow. She felt the blood before she felt the pain. He told her what he wanted. He said it clearly, which she would later note in her report as a tactical error on his part. He wanted her to withdraw every complaint she had filed. He wanted her written resignation submitted by end of business Friday. He wanted her out of Brackenridge and out of Belmont Cross, and if she cooperated, he would consider the matter closed. If she did not cooperate, he said, he would make sure her record at Brackenridge reflected poorly enough that no hospital in the state would take her on. He said, "You are one person. My father built half this town." Marin let him finish. She had been trained in combatives during her first year of service, and had cross-trained twice since then, because in the environments she had worked in, the difference between a person who could defend themselves and a person who could not was sometimes measured in whether they came home. She was not large. She did not need to be. What she needed was leverage, timing, and the willingness to commit fully to a single movement without hesitation. She used a wrist release into a redirected throw. It took approximately 2.5 seconds. Grayson went down hard onto the wet concrete, his shoulder absorbing most of the impact. He was not seriously injured. She had not intended him to be seriously injured. She had intended him to be on the ground, and no longer between her and the door. She stepped back, put distance between them, and called 911. She had called Ronan 2 hours earlier, not because she had known exactly what was coming, but because something in the shift of the past 48 hours had felt like a change in pressure, the way the air before a storm carries information before the storm itself arrives. Ronan had been in his car on the far side of the lot when it happened. He had not intervened, she had not needed him to, but he had been there, and he had seen, and that would matter later. The officers who arrived were named Calder and Briggs. Detective Trent Calder was the one who did most of the talking. He had a broad, unhurried manner and the kind of practiced neutrality that could read as professionalism until you noticed what it was neutral toward. He interviewed Grayson first, on the far side of the parking structure, out of Marin's earshot. When Calder came to speak with Marin, he had already stopped taking notes. He asked her to describe what had happened. She described it. He asked whether she and Grayson had a prior relationship. She said they had a documented harassment history with 2 formal complaints on file with hospital administration. He nodded as if she had said something mildly interesting. He asked whether she had provoked the confrontation in any way. She asked him to repeat the question. He repeated it. She gave him her answer, which was no. And she also gave him the full sequence of events in precise chronological order, including the specific words Grayson had used, the duration of the physical contact, and the fact that the security camera covering that corridor had been non-operational. She asked for his badge number. She asked for Officer Briggs's badge number. She wrote both numbers in her phone while Calder watched her do it. The incident report, when filed, described the event as a physical altercation between two parties with a prior dispute. No arrest was made. No charges were filed that night. Grayson left with a scrape on his palm and the apparent satisfaction of a man who believed the system had just confirmed what he had always assumed. Marin drove to the urgent care clinic on Route 9, rather than seeking treatment at Brackenridge. She had Deanna Walsh document the bruising on her throat before she left the hospital. Deanna had been near the locker room when Marin came back in and had not asked unnecessary questions, which Marin appreciated, and the urgent care clinic provided a formal medical record with photographs, timestamps, and a clinical description of the contusion pattern consistent with external compression by a forearm. The laceration above her eyebrow required 4 sutures. Before she went to sleep that night, she sent the urgent care report, her personal incident log for the past 93 days, the names and badge numbers of both officers, and the incident report number to 2 people, Ronan Sutter and Lenora Quinn. She had spoken with Lenora once, briefly, 2 days after the meeting with Fletcher Dane, a referral from a friend who knew her work. Lenora Quinn was a civil litigation attorney who had spent 12 years in Austin handling employment discrimination and civil rights cases before returning to her hometown of Belmont Cross to open a smaller practice. She was efficient, precise, and deeply unimpressed by institutional authority that mistook longevity for legitimacy. Lenora called Marin at 7:45 the following morning, before Marin had finished her coffee. "Tell me everything," Lenora said. "Start from the first day." Ronan arrived in Belmont Cross on a Thursday, 2 days after the assault. He drove a dark gray SUV and checked into a motel on the highway that asked no questions. Rook rode in the back, contained and alert, with the particular stillness of a working dog who had learned that most situations required patience first and action second. Ronan reviewed Marin's documentation the same afternoon. He read through it twice and then set it down and said, "This is enough to start with. I want to look at the physical locations." He and Rook walked the medical education corridor and the rear parking structure the following morning, during a time when foot traffic was minimal. Ronan moved economically, with attention distributed evenly across the environment. Rook moved with him, tracking the air, his attention moving in patterns that followed a logic invisible to anyone who hadn't worked with a trained detection dog. Near the electrical panel that controlled the rear corridor lighting, Rook stopped and indicated. Ronan crouched, examined the panel housing without touching it, and identified a residue consistent with industrial lubricant, the kind used to silence hinges and panel covers, not the kind used in routine electrical maintenance. The panel had been opened recently. The light had not failed. It had been turned off. Ronan photographed everything with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had learned the hard way that physical evidence had a limited lifespan. The second strand of the investigation came from Lenora's end. Working from Marin's complaint history and the names of other staff members who had been present during various incidents, Lenora began making calls. Within 10 days, she had spoken with 4 individuals who had either witnessed harassment by Grayson Pike or experienced it directly and chosen not to report it for reasons that all traced back to the same root, the belief that reporting would cost them more than staying silent. One of those individuals, a former administrative assistant named Patricia Holt, mentioned a name that Lenora had not encountered before: Camila Ortega. Camila had been 24 years old, a part-time hospital volunteer who had filed a formal harassment complaint against Grayson Pike approximately 18 months earlier. The complaint had been processed through Fletcher Dane's office and had been resolved through a mediated conversation. 6 weeks after filing, Camila had died in a single-vehicle accident on a county road outside Belmont Cross. The accident had been investigated by the Belmont Cross Police Department and ruled accidental. Lenora noted the investigating officer on record. It was Detective Trent Calder. She called Ronan that evening and read him the name. There was a brief silence on the line. "Send me everything you have on Camila Ortega," Ronan said. Marin sat with this information in the way she had learned to sit with difficult things, not by processing it immediately, but by letting it settle into its actual shape. She had been attacked in a corridor where the lights had been deliberately disabled, covered by a camera that had been deliberately deactivated, at the end of a route her schedule made predictable. The responding officer had a documented relationship with the family whose son had attacked her. A woman who had previously filed a similar complaint was dead. The question was no longer whether she was in danger. She had been in danger. The question was what she was going to do with 94 days of documentation, a medical record, an attorney, and a former Navy SEAL who had just found evidence of deliberate tampering at a crime scene. The answer was, continue. The pressure increased in the third week of November. Brielle Santos told Marin that she had been approached in the hospital parking lot by one of Grayson's friends who had told her, with conversational casualness, that people who made things complicated for good families in small towns tended to find their career paths becoming unexpectedly difficult. Brielle was shaking when she told Marin, not dramatically, but in the small, controlled way of someone who was frightened and ashamed of being frightened. Marin told her to write it down immediately. Date, time, location, exact words. Email herself a copy so the timestamp was external and unalterable. She told Brielle that what she was doing, continuing to show up, continuing to work, not disappearing, was a form of courage that most people would not recognize as courage, because it didn't look like anything from the outside. Brielle sent the email while Marin watched. Meanwhile, Lenora had filed a parallel complaint with the State Medical Board, a formal record outside the hospital's internal system, which meant Brackenridge could no longer alter or quietly dispose of the documentation without that alteration being detectable. The hospital's legal counsel responded within 48 hours with a letter that was professionally worded and unmistakably threatening. Fletcher Dane stopped appearing on the ER floor. Marin's shift assignments began shifting in small ways, fewer prime hours, more coverage gaps, the quiet administrative marginalization that did not appear on any single document but accumulated into a clear message. Her colleagues were polite and distant. Deanna Walsh was the exception. She said nothing directly but began quietly ensuring that Marin was never left without a witness nearby during her shifts. The termination letter arrived on a Friday morning. It came in an envelope with the Brackenridge administrative letterhead, delivered to her apartment by courier. The language was clean and thoroughly laundered of anything that could be tied to retaliation, position elimination, operational restructuring, workforce consolidation. Her last day was listed as 2 weeks from the date of the letter. There was no mention of her complaints. There was no mention of Grayson Pike. Marin read it twice, set it on her kitchen table, and called Lenora. Lenora said, "Good. This is actually good. I know it doesn't feel like it, but they just put it in writing." That afternoon, Marin drove to the hospital for her scheduled shift. She walked into the ER, changed into her scrubs, and started work. 40 minutes in, Grayson Pike walked through the ambulance bay entrance with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked across the department until he found her, and he smiled the calm, settled satisfaction of a man who believed he had won. Marin looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she turned back to her patient. Her phone buzzed 20 minutes later. It was Ronan. The message read, "We found others. 5 confirmed. 2 more probable. Lenora is coordinating. Federal contact made. Do not quit. Do not take any meetings without Lenora present. Stay visible." Marin read the message. She set her phone face down on the nurse's station counter. She picked up the next chart. The federal warrants were executed on a Wednesday. Ronan had given Marin 24 hours notice not because she needed to prepare, but because he believed she deserved to know before it became public. He called her Tuesday evening while she was eating dinner at her kitchen table, the termination letter still sitting in the same spot she had left it 4 days earlier, weighted down by a coffee mug she hadn't moved on purpose. He said, "Tomorrow morning, FBI field office out of Austin is leading. They're hitting the Pike development offices, Conrad's residence, 3 shell companies registered in Delaware, and the accounts connected to Calder and 2 other officers. Lenora has already submitted your full file as supporting documentation. You should not go to the hospital tomorrow." Marin asked why not. "Because when this breaks, Brackenridge is going to be part of the story. You don't want to be inside that building when the administration figures out what's happening. You want to be on record as someone who was kept out." She spent Tuesday night reviewing her own documentation not because she needed to revise it, but because she wanted to know it the way she knew a patient's chart before a critical procedure. Every date, every name, every word she had written down in the notebook she had started 97 days ago. She slept 4 hours. She was up before dawn. The news broke at 11:43 in the morning. Marin was sitting in Lenora's office when the first alert came through. They had been working through the formal statement Marin would submit as part of the federal investigation, a document that ran to 41 pages and covered every incident from the first day Grayson had appeared in the doorway, for her exam room to the termination letter on her kitchen. Tableau. The alert read, "FBI executes search warrants at Pike Development. Conrad Pike named in federal investigation." Lenora set her phone face down without comment and continued the sentence she had been dictating. Marin appreciated that. Within 2 hours, there were television news trucks outside the Pike Development Building on Commerce Street. By mid-afternoon, the local police department had confirmed that 3 officers, including Detective Trent Calder, had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal affairs review. By evening, Conrad Pike's attorney had issued a statement that used the phrase vigorously contest 4 times and said nothing of substance. Marin watched some of it on her laptop in the parking lot outside Lenora's building, eating a granola bar. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way she had felt after long operations that had gone well, a muted, functional relief, and underneath it the awareness that the work was not finished. She spent the next 4 days in meetings. The lead federal agent, Diane Ashworth, had been with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit for 11 years, and had the manner of someone who had learned that the most useful thing she could offer was the experience of being genuinely listened to. Marin gave her statement in 3 sessions. She presented her documentation in chronological order: written complaints and administrative responses, incident log entries, medical records, communications with Lenora, communications with Ronan, and a final section that Lenora had titled Pattern of Institutional Response, which laid out, methodically and without rhetorical flourish, the sequence by which every formal channel available to Marin had been routed around, delayed, minimized, or actively undermined. Ashworth asked about Grayson's specific words during the parking lot assault. Marin gave them verbatim. Ashworth noted everything. She did not react. She asked the next question. Ronan presented his physical evidence findings through a formal written report. The report documented the timeline of the lighting outage at the rear corridor, cross-referenced with maintenance logs that showed no scheduled work on that panel during the relevant period. It documented Rook's indication at the electrical panel housing and the presence of industrial lubricant on the interior surface, a substance that the federal investigators connected, through financial records, to a maintenance contractor whose company had received payments from a Pike Development subsidiary in the 18 months prior. The panel had been accessed within 48 hours of the assault. This transformed the attack from a spontaneous confrontation into a planned operation. Someone, not just Grayson, but someone with access and coordination, had prepared the location in advance, selected it, disabled the lighting, confirmed the camera outage, identified the timing window created by her predictable route. Lenora incorporated this finding into a civil filing that named Grayson Pike, Conrad Pike, and the maintenance contractor as defendants in a coordinated civil rights action. Rook's role in this, the moment near the panel when the dog had stopped and indicated with the quiet certainty of an animal that does not perform and does not speculate, became the detail that reporters kept returning to. Marin found this slightly absurd but understood it. People needed a moment they could hold on to. A dog that had found the truth in a place no human had thought to look was a moment that held. The investigation into Camila Ortega reopened 11 days after the warrants were executed. The State Attorney General's office took jurisdiction, removing it from the Belmont Cross Police Department entirely. A forensic accident reconstruction team was brought in to re-examine the physical evidence from the crash site. 2 witnesses who had not been interviewed during the original investigation were identified, a couple who had been driving the same road that night and had seen a second vehicle behind Camila's car in the minutes before the Gaetian Huey accident. The witness statements had not been collected because Calder had closed the investigation within 72 hours. Lenora received a message from Lucia Ortega, Camila's younger sister, 3 days after the reinvestigation was announced. It read, "My family has been waiting 18 months for someone to say that Camila's death deserved a real investigation. Thank you for not stopping." Marin read it twice, the way she read things that mattered, and then set her phone down and was quiet for a moment. She had not filed her first complaint for Camila Ortega. She had not known Camila existed. She had filed her first complaint because Grayson Pike had been standing in the doorway of her exam room making remarks she found professionally intolerable, and she had been trained in a context far more demanding than this one to document what she saw and act on what she documented. The fact that doing so had ultimately mattered to Lucia Ortega was not something she had planned. It was something that had happened because she had refused to stop at the point where stopping would have been easiest. Brackenridge Medical Center announced a review of its administrative practices on the same day that Fletcher Dane was placed on indefinite suspension. The board issued a statement expressing support for all employees who had raised concerns through appropriate channels, which Marin found notable given that the appropriate channels had spent 3 months telling her to be quiet. The formal reversal of her termination came through Lenora's office. The letter reversing it was 2 paragraphs. It cited changed circumstances and offered reinstatement at her previous position with back pay for the period of her administrative leave. Lenora sent Marin a copy with a single handwritten note attached. "Your call. No deadline. No pressure. Marin left it on her kitchen table next to the original termination letter. She went for a long run through the Cedar Hills north of town, and came back and showered and made coffee and sat with both letters in front of her for a long time. She returned to Brackenridge on a Monday morning, 5 weeks after the warrants. Not tentatively. Not with the careful smallness of someone who has been diminished. She walked in through the main entrance, went to the locker room, changed, and arrived at the nurse's station 2 minutes before the start of her shift. Deanna Walsh was there. She looked at Marin with the expression of a person who had a great deal to say and had decided none of it needed to be said aloud. She handed Marin the first chart of the morning and said, "Bed 4 has been waiting." Marin took the chart. She went to bed 4. She found Brielle Santos on the bench outside the hospital's main entrance that afternoon, during her break. Brielle was in her clinical uniform, eating a sandwich. She looked up when Marin sat down beside her and visibly didn't know what to say. "I heard you got your program acceptance," Marin said. "The accelerated BSN at UT Austin. I find out about scholarship funding next month. That's what you wanted." "Yeah." Brielle was quiet for a moment. "I was scared. When that guy approached me in the parking lot, I didn't know if I should tell you or just stay out of it." "You told me," Marin said. "I know, but I almost didn't." Marin looked out at the parking lot, the ordinary daylit, populated parking lot where nothing threatening was happening. "The record doesn't say you almost didn't," she said. "It says you did. That's the only part that counts." Ronan was parked across the street when she came out at the end of her shift. The SUV was pulled to the curb on the far side of the visitor lot, gray and unremarkable. Rook was visible in the rear window, his dark face alert, ears slightly forward, not tense, not reactive, simply present in the way of an animal that takes the world seriously. Ronan got out when he saw her and leaned against the side of the vehicle with his arms folded. He said, "How was it?" "Fine," she said. "Busy. Normal." He nodded. The last ambulance of the evening shift came in fast from the north, its lights strobing across the parking lot surface, and Marin turned instinctively toward the sound, the reflexive orientation of someone whose nervous system had been organized around the arrival of people who needed help. She turned back to Ronan. "I should go back in," she said. "Yeah," he said. She looked at the building, the expanded, architecturally inconsistent, perpetually understaffed building that had tried to make her disappear and had failed, and then she straightened her jacket, and she went back inside. Here is what this story is really about. Marin never had a dramatic speech. She never confronted anyone in a hallway or demanded justice in a crowded room. What she did was quieter and, in the end, harder. She kept the file. Every day, in a notebook she kept at home, she wrote down what happened. She kept going when the first complaint was buried. She kept going when the second was ignored. She kept going when the police bent the report, when the administration sent the termination letter, when Grayson stood in the ER doorway and smiled like it was already over. The system was designed to make her feel like she was one person against something too large to move, and she was one person. That part was true. But one person with a record, an attorney, and 2 people who showed up when it counted that turns out to be enough to pull the thread that unravels everything. Brielle Santos got her program. Lucia Ortega's family got a real investigation, and Belmont Cross got a little less room for the kind of darkness that had been allowed to settle there for too long. Not because someone arrived to rescue Marin, because Marin refused to let the record disappear. If that resonated with you, if you believe that the quiet, unglamorous act of not staying silent matters, subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And we'll be back next week with another one.